He invited his ex-wife to the gala to watch her disappear. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if you believe dignity is the strongest revenge, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to her story. The invitation had been sitting on Claire Monroe's kitchen counter for 3 days, its ivory envelope catching the morning light like a dare. Monroe and Vale's annual foundation gala. Black tie, crystal ballroom, 5-star hotel downtown. The kind of room where money learned how to smile. Claire stood there in her quiet apartment, one hand resting on the edge of the counter, the other still wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. She did not need to open the invitation to know who had sent it. Ethan Vale had never been subtle, even in cruelty. 15 years of marriage had taught her that. The polished shoes, the expensive cologne, the voice that could turn a compliment into a wound without ever raising its volume. The last time she had seen him, he had looked right through her, as if the woman beside him had already become a footnote in his life. And yet there it was, her name printed in elegant black script, as if he had chosen the font himself just to make the insult feel formal. Claire set the mug down and looked out the window at the pale November sky over Chicago. Bare trees lined the street below. A city bus hissed to a stop. Somewhere in the building, someone was playing soft piano music through a thin wall. Life, ordinary and stubborn, kept moving. She had learned to do the same. That was the part Ethan never understood. He had expected her to break loudly. Instead, she had rebuilt herself in silence. A smaller apartment, yes. A simpler life, yes. But the mornings belonged to her now. The silence belonged to her. The steady breath in her chest belonged to her. When she left him, she had carried away nothing glamorous, only a cardboard box of books, a ceramic bowl with a chipped rim, and the ability to keep walking when every instinct begged her to look back. Back then, she had been the kind of woman who dimmed herself to keep peace in a room. She wore neutral colors. She spoke carefully. She laughed at jokes that were not funny. She made space for his ambitions, his meetings, his ego. And in return, he had made her feel like a guest in her own marriage. Now she glanced at the invitation again, then reached for the closet door. In the back, covered in a garment bag, hung a dress she had almost not bought. Deep emerald, clean lines, quietly expensive, not loud enough to beg for attention, but impossible to ignore once seen. Claire touched the fabric once, then let her fingers fall away. She was not dressing for him. She was dressing for herself. Because somewhere between the woman who had been left behind and the woman standing here now, something had changed. Not all at once. Not with fireworks. Just in the slow, deliberate way a cracked foundation becomes strong again when no one is watching. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A reminder from her assistant. 7 o'clock. Arrive early. Use the side entrance. Claire smiled, small and unreadable. Ethan had always loved an audience. Tonight, she would give him one. And then she would give him the one thing he had never counted on, her calm. The hotel rose out of the downtown skyline like a promise made in glass and steel, every window lit with the soft, expensive glow of people who believed the world had already chosen their side. Inside, the ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, and the air carried the faint mix of white roses, polished marble, and cologne that cost more than rent. Claire stepped through the side entrance exactly at 7, her emerald dress catching the light in one quiet line at a time. No one turned yet. That was all right. She had learned that true entrances did not announce themselves in a hurry. They waited. They let the room settle first. Her heels moved over the floor without hesitation, and the cold calm on her face made her look less like a woman arriving late, and more like a woman returning to a place that had once belonged to her. Near the far end of the room, Ethan was already holding court beside the foundation banner, smiling too widely, one hand in his pocket, the other resting on the back of a chair, as if the whole evening had been arranged to flatter him. He looked polished, confident, untouched by consequence. The kind of man who still believed charm could cover 1,000 small cruelties. Claire did not look at him for long. She did not need to. She could feel his attention before it found her, like the subtle shift in a room when a familiar ghost walks in wearing a better dress. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne flutes, and she took one, lifting it only to let the rim rest against her fingers. Around her, voices floated in neat, harmless fragments. Foundation donors, board members, old classmates she had not seen in years, all of them moving in that polished social rhythm where everyone pretended not to be watching everyone else. Claire smiled when she was greeted, nodded when introduced, and answered with the same unhurried grace she had spent the last 3 years building brick by brick. Not because she needed their approval, because she had survived the version of herself that once did. On the far side of the ballroom, Ethan finally saw her. The change was almost imperceptible at first, a pause in his smile, a tightening around the eyes, the brief stillness of a man who had expected a shadow and received a woman instead. He excused himself from the circle around him and started across the room with the confident stride of someone preparing to reclaim a moment. Claire watched him approach without moving, her expression unreadable, her posture serene. She had once spent entire evenings bracing for the sound of his disappointment, the smallest sigh, the lifted eyebrow, the quiet ways he made her feel less than enough. Tonight, she felt none of that. Tonight, she stood in her own silence, and it was stronger than anything he could say. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his smile returning in that practiced way that never reached his eyes. There was surprise there, but also something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first faint crack of fear. Claire tilted her head, just slightly, as if she were greeting a stranger at a table she had no intention of leaving. And across the ballroom, the room seemed to hold its breath around them. Claire did not look away when Ethan reached her. She simply let the silence stretch, polished and exact, until it became its own kind of pressure. The music swelled somewhere behind him, bright strings and soft laughter drifting over the ballroom. But around them the air had narrowed into something sharp and quiet. Ethan smiled as if he were still in control of the room. "You came," he said, the words light, almost amused, as though her presence had been a private joke he was now ready to share with everyone else. Claire let her gaze pass over him once, taking in the tailored suit, the expensive watch, the careful arrogance. He still wore confidence like cologne, heavy enough to be noticed, never enough to be remembered. "You invited me," she replied, her voice even, neither warm nor cold, simply finished. That small answer seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. His smile tightened. He had expected tremors, perhaps, a lowered gaze, a sign that the old version of her was still waiting somewhere beneath the surface, still willing to bend. But Claire stood with both feet planted, one hand resting loosely at her side, the other holding a champagne flute she had no intention of drinking. The emerald silk of her dress caught another blade of light from the chandeliers, and for a brief moment the room seemed to notice her all at once. Not because she was loud, because she was impossible to ignore. Across the ballroom, heads turned and then turned again, the movement rippling outward in a chain of quiet curiosity. Ethan noticed it too. He glanced past her shoulder, then back to her face, as if looking for the person she had brought with her, the missing piece he had not been told about. Claire did not offer anything, not an explanation, not an apology, not even a hint. She had learned that some truths lost power the moment they were rushed. Better to let them arrive fully formed, with their own weight. Ethan lowered his voice. "You look different." It was meant to sound generous, but there was something else buried under it, a test. He was searching for the old fracture, the place where his words used to land and stay. Claire gave him the smallest, calmest smile. "So do you," she said, and there was no cruelty in it, only certainty. Behind Ethan, one of his colleagues laughed too loudly at something that no longer sounded funny. A waiter moved past with a tray of crystal glasses, the soft clink of glass against glass briefly lifting over the room. The ballroom continued breathing around them, elegant and unaware, but the tension between Claire and Ethan had become the center of everything. He tried again, his tone taking on that familiar edge of control. "I was not sure you would accept." Claire's fingers tightened once around the stem of the glass, then relaxed. "You should have been more careful about what you hoped for," she said. Ethan blinked, just once. It was a small reaction, but Claire saw it clearly, the first real crack in the polished surface he had brought with him tonight. He glanced toward the far end of the room, where the guests had begun to notice the exchange, and she saw him measuring the attention, weighing the risk of being seen standing here with a woman he had once dismissed too easily. That was the trouble with power built on assumption. It required everyone else to remain unchanged. Claire had not remained unchanged. She had become quieter, and in that quiet, stronger. Somewhere near the stage, the host tapped a microphone, testing the sound. A subtle feedback hum passed through the room like a warning. Ethan straightened his jacket, recovered just enough to perform composure again. But his eyes kept returning to Claire's face as if he could still not quite solve the woman standing in front of him. He had invited her to witness his rise, to sit in the shadow of his certainty and remember where she had once belonged. Instead, she had arrived carrying something far more dangerous than resentment. She had arrived with peace. And as the first announcement began to gather at the front of the ballroom, Claire turned her champagne flute slowly between her fingers and waited for the room to learn what Ethan had not yet guessed. She had not come to beg. She had come to be seen. The years after the divorce had not been glamorous. They had been quiet, stubborn, and earned one careful choice at a time. Claire had learned how to rise before the city did, how to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, how to sit alone in a room and no longer feel like she was waiting to be chosen. In the apartment she now kept downtown, sunlight slid across the pale wood floors each morning and settled on the framed sketches near the window, the old evidence of a life she had built with her own hands. There were no chandeliers there, no applause, no audience. Just the steady rhythm of her own breathing, the soft hiss of the kettle, the clean scent of citrus soap on her wrists. And that was enough. It had to be enough. She wore her independence the way some women wore silk, not loudly, but with a certain natural ease that could not be borrowed. At the office, people had begun to notice the difference before they understood it. She listened more than she spoke. She moved with less hesitation. She had stopped shrinking when men with louder voices entered a room. She had become the kind of woman who did not ask permission to occupy space. The old Claire would have called that change survival. The new Claire simply called it peace. On the morning after the gala invitation arrived, she stood by the kitchen counter with a chipped white mug in her hands and looked out over the city as if it belonged to someone else. Ethan had once made her feel as though her worth depended on his opinion, on his mood, on whether he was proud enough to offer warmth and cruel enough to withhold it. But that version of her was gone now, buried under years of long nights and honest work. In its place stood a woman who had paid every cost herself. She had taken the loneliness, the embarrassment, the long stretches of doubt, and turned them into something steadier. Something no one in Ethan's world would recognize at first glance. By noon, a message from her assistant confirmed the final details for the evening. The car would arrive at 6:45. Her name would be on the guest list. Her seat would be near the front. Claire read the message once, then set her phone down and folded her hands loosely on the table. There was no tremor in them, no rush, only the cool, deliberate stillness of a person who had already survived the worst version of a story. Across town, Ethan was still arranging his own performance, still expecting the evening to unfold like a stage built around him. He had always mistaken restraint for weakness. He had never understood that silence could be a strategy. Claire reached for her jacket, paused, and glanced at the mirror near the door. The woman looking back at her was calm, composed, almost unfamiliar in her certainty. Not broken, not pleading, not waiting, just ready. And somewhere deep beneath that calm, a door that had been closed for years had finally begun to open again. The message came just after 4 in the afternoon, when the city light had turned pale and the apartment was filling with the soft quiet of late day. Claire stood at the kitchen counter with her phone in one hand and a half-finished cup of coffee cooling beside her, reading the invitation from her assistant for the third time. There would be no changes, no delays, no excuses. Her seat would be reserved near the front, exactly where Ethan had wanted it. He had arranged the evening like a display case, placing every person and every detail where he could admire them. Claire set the phone down and looked toward the window, where the skyline reflected against the glass in clean, silver lines. Somewhere below, traffic moved in steady streams, horns muted by distance, people going home to dinners, to arguments, to ordinary lives. Hers had never been ordinary, not after Ethan, not after the years that followed. The first years after the divorce had been measured in small victories no one else would have noticed. A lease signed in her own name, a desk by the window, a morning routine that belonged only to her. The apartment was modest by the standards of the world Ethan had always worshipped, but it was hers down to the last framed sketch on the wall and the narrow ceramic bowl by the sink. Nothing in it had been chosen to impress anyone. Everything in it had been chosen to restore her. Claire crossed to the window and rested her fingertips against the cool pane. The reflected woman looking back at her wore a simple black dress hanging on the bedroom door and a calm expression that would have seemed impossible to the version of herself Ethan had once known. Back then, she had apologized before speaking. Back then, she had lowered her eyes when men like him filled a room. Back then, she had mistaken endurance for love. Now, the silence in the apartment felt different. It was not emptiness. It was structure. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a long season of being told who you are, when the world finally goes still enough for you to decide for yourself. Her phone buzzed again. A final reminder from her assistant. The driver would be downstairs at 6:45. The photographer would meet her at the entrance. The guest list had been checked twice. Claire read the message, then placed the phone face down on the counter with careful, unhurried fingers. No tremor. No hesitation. Across town, Ethan was likely already dressing for the night, fastening his cuff links, rehearsing the version of himself he intended to present to the room. He had always loved control when it looked like charm. He had always preferred an audience that clapped at the right time. Claire knew that about him better than anyone. That was what made her so still now. She was not rushing toward the evening. She was arriving on her own terms. She went to the bedroom and lifted the black dress from its hanger. The fabric was smooth and weighty in her hands, elegant without demanding attention, the kind of dress that did not need to speak loudly to be remembered. She stepped into it, drew the zipper up slowly, and studied her reflection as the city light gathered across her shoulders. No borrowed sparkle, no nervous smile, just a woman who had learned how to stand inside her own life without flinching. Her gaze settled on the mirror a moment longer, and something in it deepened, not into anger, but into resolve. By the time the driver arrived, Claire was already ready. She picked up her small clutch, turned once to look at the apartment that had carried her back to herself, and walked to the door with the steady calm of someone who had stopped asking permission to enter the room. Tonight, Ethan would see her, but he would not be the one deciding what her presence meant. That part of the story had already changed. By 6 o'clock, the city had begun to soften at the edges, the hard lines of the afternoon giving way to the amber hush of evening. Claire stood in front of the bedroom mirror with her hand resting lightly on the edge of the dresser, watching herself in the black dress she had chosen without hesitation. It was simple, tailored, and quietly expensive in the way that never needed to announce itself. The fabric fell cleanly over her frame, moving with her instead of against her, and the effect was not to make her look newer, but steadier. Her hair had been pinned back with care, and the small earrings she wore caught the light each time she turned her head. Nothing about her begged for attention. Everything about her held it. On the bed behind her, her clutch lay beside the invitation she had already read twice, then a third time, as if repetition might somehow make the meaning less sharp. It did not. Ethan had arranged the evening with the kind of precision that always carried a hidden edge. A reserved seat near the front. A program that would place her name in the room before she even crossed the threshold. A public setting dressed up as courtesy. Claire knew that sort of courtesy well. It was the polished shape of control. She looked at her reflection and did not look away. There had been a version of her, years ago, who would have questioned the dress, the seat, the invitation itself, as if her own presence required permission. That woman had lived too long in rooms where she was expected to shrink. But the woman in the mirror now was different. She had learned how to stand still without folding inward. She had learned that silence could be a boundary, and composure could be a line no one crossed twice. The apartment behind her was quiet in the warm, late-day way of a place that had become a refuge rather than a shelter of necessity. A ceramic mug sat near the sink, now cold. A book she had opened in the afternoon remained face down on the sofa. Small things, ordinary things, but they carried the weight of a life rebuilt with patience, one habit at a time, one morning at a time, one hard decision at a time. She reached for the small clutch, checked the slim line of her lipstick in the mirror, and then let her hand fall back to her side. There was no hurry in her movements, no restless pacing, no last-minute doubt rising to the surface. If anything, the stillness around her felt deliberate, almost sacred. Outside, a car door closed in the street below. She glanced toward the window and saw the reflection of the city lights beginning to gather against the glass, pale gold against the deepening blue. For a moment, She thought of the evening ahead not as a test, but as a threshold. On one side was the life Ethan still imagined he could define. On the other was the life she had already claimed. Claire picked up her clutch, turned off the bedroom light, and moved through the apartment with an even, unhurried step. Each sound was small and clean. The soft click of her heel on the floor, the gentle pull of the front door, the quiet breath she released before stepping into the hallway. By the time she reached the elevator, her face was calm, her shoulders set, her gaze forward. No borrowed courage. No visible strain. Just a woman walking toward a room that would soon have to make space for the truth. The ballroom had settled into that dangerous kind of quiet that only appears when a room senses something is about to change. Crystal chandeliers scattered light over polished glass and black-tie smiles. But beneath the fragrance of champagne and expensive perfume, the air carried a thin edge of anticipation. Claire stood near the edge of the room with her champagne flute resting lightly in her hand, her posture unshaken, her expression unreadable. She did not need to search for Ethan. She felt him before she saw him, the way old wounds sometimes announced themselves before they were visible. He was still surrounded by the kind of people who laughed too quickly at his jokes and listened too closely to his opinions. His confidence had not aged into wisdom. It had only become more polished. He turned first, as if expecting the room to make way for him, and when his eyes landed on Claire, something flickered there. Surprise, maybe, or disbelief that she had not arrived diminished, apologetic, or alone. Claire gave him nothing. No tremor. No smile meant to soothe. Only a steady look that held its place and refused to yield. Around them, the noise began to gather in small, curious ripples. Conversation softened. Heads turned. Someone near the bar lowered their glass. Ethan said something to the man beside him, his mouth shaping a confident half-smile, but his attention never left her. He looked at her dress, at the stillness in her shoulders, at the way she stood as if the room belonged to her as much as it belonged to anyone else. It unsettled him more than anger would have. Anger was familiar. This calm was not. Claire took one slow breath and let the memory of every room in which she had once been made to feel small pass through her and out again. The girl who had once hurried to explain herself was gone. The woman standing here had learned the difference between being noticed and being diminished. Ethan stepped closer, and for a brief moment the space between them seemed to tighten with everything neither of them would say. His gaze moved over her face as though searching for a weakness to name aloud, but he found none he could use. There was only composure, quiet and precise, the kind that could not be bought or performed. The first announcement of the evening had not yet begun, but the room was already waiting. Waiting for a name, waiting for a reveal, waiting for the moment someone would finally explain why Claire had walked in with such unbothered certainty, as if the past had lost its grip on her somewhere between the door and the lights. Ethan opened his mouth, perhaps to offer the kind of remark that once would have made her shrink, but Claire lifted her chin by the smallest degree and looked past him, not in defiance, but in complete refusal to grant him the center of the scene. It was a quieter power than confrontation. More final, too. Across the room, waitstaff moved with careful precision, rearranging glasses on a silver tray. A string quartet played something elegant and distant, each note suspended in the air like a held breath. Claire listened to none of it, and all of it at once. She kept her hand steady around the flute, the cool stem anchoring her, while the room continued to tighten around the silence she had made. Ethan still did not understand what everyone else was beginning to sense. She was no longer here to relive the past. She was here to let the present speak for itself. The room had been holding its breath for several minutes by the time Ethan finally understood that Claire was not there to be cornered. She stood beneath the chandelier light with her champagne flute still untouched, the kind of stillness that made every movement around her seem louder, clumsier, less certain. Ethan had spent too many years believing that silence meant surrender. Tonight, he was learning how wrong that belief could be. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket and took one measured step toward her, his expression arranged into the polished confidence he used when he wanted the room to believe he still controlled it. A few guests noticed the approach and began to watch more closely. Claire felt the shift before she saw it. It moved through the ballroom in a ripple of lowered voices and angled faces, the subtle social weather that always followed a man who expected to be obeyed. Then Ethan stopped beside her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, close enough for everyone nearby to hear the edges of whatever he chose to say. "You really did come," he said, smiling as if he had granted her permission to be there. "I was beginning to think you would avoid this place after everything." His words were soft, but they carried the familiar arrogance of a man who mistook restraint for weakness. Claire turned her head slowly, her gaze settling on him with a calm so exact it almost felt ceremonial. There was no tremor in her hand, no visible offense, no need to rush to defend herself against a version of the past he still preferred to repeat. "I do not avoid rooms just because they remember me," she said. The sentence was quiet, almost delicate, but it landed with a precision that made Ethan blink once, as though he had expected gratitude, embarrassment, or pain, and had received none of them. Around them, the ballroom remained elegantly composed, but the attention in it had changed. People who had been pretending not to listen were now listening. Ethan gave a small laugh that was meant to dismiss her, meant to re-establish old distance, old hierarchy, old certainty. "You always did like saying the right thing at the right time," he replied. "That is probably why it took you so long to say anything at all when it mattered." Claire did not flinch. She let the insult pass through the space between them and disappear without finding a place to land. Then she lifted her eyes past his shoulder, toward the far end of the room, where the entrance had begun to stir again. One of the event coordinators had straightened near the door. The quartet softened. Even the waitstaff moved with a subtle awareness that something had changed. Ethan noticed the shift only after the guests nearest the entrance started turning their heads. His smile faltered first, then recovered too late. Claire saw the recognition move across his face before he even saw who had arrived. It was a familiar expression now, this small fracture in his certainty, this sudden need to understand whether he still had control of the narrative. The answer was already walking toward him. Claire set her glass on the nearest tray with deliberate care, as though she had all the time in the world. She did not rush. She did not look hurried or surprised. She simply waited, shoulders relaxed, expression unreadable, while the room opened itself in a narrow path of light and attention. Ethan followed the line of everyone else's gaze, and the color left his face in a way he could not hide. Because the man crossing the ballroom was not merely well-dressed, not merely familiar in the expensive, effortless way of someone used to being noticed. He carried himself with the quiet authority of ownership, the kind that did not need to announce itself. And when he reached Claire, he did not speak to the room first. He looked at her, briefly, warmly, with the unmistakable ease of someone who had already earned the right to stand beside her. Then he offered his hand. Claire placed hers in it without hesitation. It was such a simple gesture that it almost looked ordinary, until the entire room understood what it meant. Ethan understood at last, and that delay cost him everything. The man's other hand rested lightly at Claire's back as he guided her forward, not possessive, not performative, just steady, as if he knew exactly where she belonged and had no interest in arguing with anyone about it. A few people recognized him at once. Others did not, but they could feel the change in the air. The room was no longer watching a woman arrive. It was watching a story turn. Ethan's mouth opened slightly, then closed. The confidence he had worn so carefully now seemed too small for his face. Claire, still composed, still silent, looked directly ahead as if the past had become nothing more than scenery behind her. And that was when the man beside her finally spoke, his voice calm and controlled, carrying easily through the ballroom without effort or threat. He introduced himself first, then turned toward Claire with a slight inclination of his head, a gesture of unmistakable respect. The room did not need a second explanation. The truth was written in the way he stood beside her, in the way the guest straightened, in the way Ethan suddenly looked as though the floor beneath him had shifted. Claire had not come to reclaim anything from the past. She had come with a future already waiting at her side. The room stayed still for a long moment after his introduction, as if every guest needed time to understand what they were seeing. Claire remained exactly where she was, one hand resting lightly around the stem of her champagne flute, her expression calm enough to make the entire ballroom feel suddenly over-decorated and fragile. Beside her, the man in the dark tailored suit did not rush to fill the silence. He let it live for a beat longer, and that patience said more than any announcement ever could. Ethan had the look of someone standing on the edge of a thought he did not want to have. His face had gone pale beneath the warm chandelier light, his fingers tightening once around the base of his glass before he set it down untouched. The woman he had once dismissed as forgettable was standing in the center of the most crowded room in the city, and no one was looking at him anymore. That was the part he could not bear. Claire could feel the shift around her without turning her head. The whispers were low, careful, almost respectful now, moving through the crowd like a current beneath polished shoes and expensive perfume. She did not need to search for approval. She had already lived too long without it to mistake attention for worth. The man at her side reached for her hand, not possessively, but with a quiet certainty that made the gesture feel like a promise the room was not invited to question. His thumb brushed once across her knuckles, a small, grounding motion, and Claire allowed herself the faintest breath. Not relief, not triumph, something steadier than both. Ethan finally found his voice, though it came out thinner than he likely expected. He tried to say her name with the same ownership he once used in private, but the sound barely carried. Claire lifted her eyes to him at last, and the look she gave him was not cruel. It was simply finished. There was no anger in it, no plea, no open wound begging to be seen. Only the quiet certainty of someone who had already walked through the fire and refused to stay marked by it. The man beside her then turned slightly, just enough for the room to notice the strength in his posture, the ease in the way he belonged there. He spoke again, calm and formal, thanking the host for the evening and mentioning the purpose of his visit in the kind of voice that made boardrooms listen and executives straighten their ties. A few people recognized the name immediately. More began to understand when they saw the way Ethan's shoulders tightened. He was not merely standing beside Claire. He was standing above the version of the world Ethan thought he still controlled. Claire felt the final piece settle into place without needing to announce it. The past had arrived with all its noise and embarrassment, but it had found her no longer waiting in the same place. She was not here to be chosen, defended, or rescued. She was here because she had already been claimed by a life that asked nothing of her except that she keep becoming herself. And as the music resumed softly beneath the chandeliers, as the guests slowly remembered how to breathe, Claire gave a small, almost private smile and turned toward the future at her side, leaving the past exactly where it belonged.